Today we're going to be looking at what goes into cutting Paraiba Tourmaline. What goes into considering a parcel of Paraiba rough, determining if this parcel is going to be profitable or we should pass. There are many things that we're going to discuss today with respects to the analysis aspect. So words like yield, what are we going to understand about the yield that we're going to get from the parcel that we're looking at? Things like crystal direction. How does crystal direction affect what outcome we're going to get in the stones? And how do we use that to consider whether a parcel is a good deal or not? And then, of course, profitability. I mean, is this going to be something where we're going to make profit? Are we going to break even? Is this even worth attempting? Because there's a certain level of analysis of rough that is really speculative. I mean, we're assuming if all things go right, this will be our outcome. So, I mean, at what point does the risk outweigh the potential gain? So we're going to be looking at a parcel today. We've got our friend Cake Boss coming to visit us. He's going to be showing us a parcel of Paraiba Tourmaline. We're going to be considering all of these aspects, all of these analysis points, yield, crystal direction, differences in color, and then really the risk associated with this parcel. We're going to try and understand in this very short video what goes into the analysis and how we come up with a determination of whether or not this is a good deal. After we've done the analysis aspect and we've determined, okay, this is a parcel that we're going to consider, this is a parcel we're going to buy, what goes into the processing of rough Paraiba Tourmaline? What goes into the cutting, determining shapes, determining what we should cut into rounds, what we should cut into ovals and pear shapes? How do we determine what treatments we're going to need to do to these stones, if any? Do we leave them as unheated stones? Do we add a clarity enhancement oil in the stones? What exactly is the pitfalls and what exactly are the pros and cons of this parcel with respects to when we start cutting it? So when we start cutting it, what are the things that we're going to encounter and how is this going to affect our decision, our buying decision on this parcel? So once we've analyzed this and we've taken the stones to the cutting wheel, what actually happens when we start cutting Paraiba? What actually happens when stones start chipping and you start losing some of that yield percentage that we were expecting? I mean, how do we compensate for that in the cutting process? I mean, do we maybe start cutting sets and matched pairs because we've actually lost so much in the single stones that now it makes more sense for us to add value? Everything's about adding value, right? So we're adding value to this production by the way we cut it. If we've already assumed the responsibility that we're taking this parcel, now we have to add value to ensure that we'll be able to get our return back with a profit on these stones. So we're going to go through the analysis process and then we're going to go through the cutting process. We're going to have a live cutting session where we're going to have our cutter preforming and showing us what are the decisions that we are making to ensure that our end result is one that is profitable.
Here is part of the process, right? So right now we are looking at these parcels. These stones are already ours. We've got one parcel here of like an inferior material that is very dry in the sense the crystallization is not as good. And one of the things that have been suggested is using like a resinous oil. And this would help keep the stones together as we're cutting, because once these stones heat up that are a bit more, they have a bit more inclusions, they're a bit drier of a material. Once they heat up on the cutting wheel, a lot of times they can break and crack. So you've got like this is a much nicer material. So this is a bit more of a more included drier material that we did this first test with. This is a higher lot. We have another lot as well that's being worked on, but so this higher lot here, we're separating out these very, very top quality, top color, top clarity stones that we're gonna separate. And then these that are larger, deeper color, also very top quality. We're gonna go through here and pick some of the best and keep this to the side. Like I was saying, we're gonna take the best and keep it to the side because this is the profit. The profit is in the higher end goods. There's two main separations of quality. You have like the top, which is the top end, and you have pretty much everything else. And then in that everything else, you can do another sorting. When we're buying rough, when we're trying to understand what yield is gonna be, we really need to understand what is the top end of the goods, because we separate that out, that's gonna be our profit. And we have to sell the lower end goods to cover our cost. If we can make profit on the lower end goods, great too, but if we can at least cover our cost with the lower end goods or the not top goods, then the top goods become profit, and that's a really good strategy. Here we had in this first pile, which is our, you could call it the lower end pile of the set. We had 40 grams.
Yes.
We had 40 grams from this set here. This is before preforming. So as rough, we had 40 grams, and then it yielded about 80 carats. So we can do the math on that. The 80 carats is what yielded from the preforming. Now, after it's preformed, it has to go to the lap wheel and facets have to be cut out of it. And then we can expect what, like a 50% loss?
Yes.
Something like that, right? So from 80 carats, it'll drop down to like 40 carats. So this is where we have to determine the value that we're able to invest in the rough, knowing that the yield is going to be that like 40 carats from 40 grams. So that's like 1 for 1, that's like a 20% yield. So 1 for 1, we say 1 gram, 1 carat. Usually that's the math that we do with Paraiba, 1 for 1, unless they're absolute gem. If they're absolute gem, then you get a better yield. But in general, what we're looking at is 1 for 1, 1 gram for 1 carat. And that's what we got here. This is what we're expecting. So of those 40 grams, we're gonna pull out 40 carats of cut material that we expect. I'm gonna calculate this with my uncle here in a second so we can get an idea of what we're expecting from this. So this is very, very fine material. This is the kind of stuff that would only cut rounds. We have to send this like this to the cutting factory for them to immediately dop them, which is put them on that little stick with the resin at the top so that they can cut it on the wheel. They would immediately cut this. And basically we would get a bunch of different colors, a bunch of different qualities, and then we would do the sorting post-cutting. Here, 200 some odd grams, that's gonna turn into something like 60 or 70 carats. Here, we've already got the 40 carats that we're expecting from these 80 grams. So we've got 80 grams here, we're expecting 40 carats. Here, we've got another 36 grams, and there's another 30 that are already cutting. So that's another 60. So 60 and 40, 100, and then maybe we'll get 60 or 70 here. So about 170 carats is what we're expecting in goods. Consider this different than this, okay? Here is that concept. We want to try and use the lower end to pay for the investment. This is going to help do that. If we can yield 70 carats from here of like fine Brazilian meli, this is all meli, right? Some of these stones are going to be single stones. This is going to be meli. Then we're looking at an investment that can be profitable because the investment will be paid off by the meli. Let's see if I can show that. Oh, these are so nice. Oh my God. Natural. All these are cut little clean stones. These are some nice big ones. One crystal here and the different orientation of the crystal. All right, so you can see down the C-axis on this crystal is like a super, super, super blue. And here it's almost like a little bit of lighter blue. When you cut this stone, the colors are gonna mix, okay? The lapidary has to make a decision. I mean, with this rough, you don't have many options. This is from the other side, you can't see it too well, it's really. So from the top of the crystal, look at that blue, like that is your characteristic Paraiba blue. But unfortunately, it's a flat stone. So because of that, we have to cut it like this, where the colors will mix. So you get some of this color and some of this color. This is definitely your A-axis, which is like straight through the crystal. And then it looks like this way is your C-axis. Again, this is one of those flat stones. So you've got one color here and another color here. This one, you got one color here and you got one color there. You see, so this piece would turn into something like this after the colors mix. So I've been talking a lot about yield. I've been talking a lot about the percentage of loss. I've been talking a lot about how many carats come out, the orientation of the crystal, the different colors, tones, and saturations. With rough, sometimes it's hard to see saturation because, you can see the color, but it's really when you put facets on the stone that you get the reflection, then you get the saturation, you get the neon. And you have to kind of wait to see the end process. There's a saying that my uncle has, like, you're really excited when you see the rough. You get really depressed when you start cutting. And then when everything's faceted and done, then you get happy again. It is a roller coaster of emotions because, once you see it in the formed and you see how much loss and you see how some stones break, some stones need to be treated, some stones, they don't survive the process. But with Paraiba, it's beautiful because there's such a little bit amount of material available that whatever you can get in cut stones is valuable. It's going to have value, and you should be able to pay off your investment and start profiting. Real quick, I'm going to run through some of the tools that we use when we're preparing Paraiba. So the production process starts with the rough, the sorting. We want to make sure that we are calculating the yield. We're making the purchase. Okay, we bought the stones. What happens next? We have to obviously weigh and separate the stones. We've got, let me see if okay, very important, a good scale. We've got also the ovens. So these ovens are gonna be what we use to heat stones. Okay, here's another one. We got lots of ovens that we use to heat Paraiba to ensure we get the best color. Two of the main components when cutting Paraiba. Cutting Paraiba requires sawing, very thin sawing, and then what we call the rebolo, which is the lap. So this is the wheel. It is got a grit on it, and it helps us cut the stone down. So we're going to be using the lap, and we're going to be using the saw. The saw is really for larger stones. We use this to cut out big major inclusions. We probably won't be using this right now for these small millimeter stones, but this we will use tremendously. This is going to help us form the stone into the shape that it will ultimately become after it's faceted. So we're gonna start looking at a few of the difficulties, some of the challenges that we run into with Paraiba, one of them being stones that break. So here, this is the first stone that we're gonna be working on. This is one of the nicer gem quality materials. This is gonna be the one where crystal orientation matters the most. Mostra aí como é que seria o C, o axis, que a maioria das pessoas fariam trilhante. Como é que eles fariam? So this is like how most people would cut this stone. They would cut it there, but you'd lose a lot of weight. And then this would be the way that we would do it. So we're cutting it like half C axis, half A axis, and this is going to yield the best result as far as size for this little stone that has this what you could call the proper way to do it. Most people would, not the proper way, the way that most people would try and do this would be cutting on the C axis and creating the bluest stone. However, to gain some weight, we have to turn it half C axis, half A axis, and it's going to give us still a blue stone, maybe a little bit lighter in color, but a lot more size and weight, which is what we're looking for. So we're going to start by doing this one. This is going to be, again, this is part of the process that we go through when we're cutting Paraiba Tourmaline. We have to... So what we're looking at here right now is we're forming this first stone where rather than going the standard route, which would be cutting the C axis, the face of the stone on the C axis, which would yield the most color, we're actually going to be cutting it half C axis, half A axis, which was what we call meia cara, which is half face. And basically what this does is it mixes the color of the stone together, the C axis and the A axis, and it yields a larger stone. So if we were to cut straight down the C axis, we might get like a 10-point stone, or even smaller, maybe an 8-point stone. But because we're gonna cut this half and half, it might yield like a 20-point stone. And at the end of the day, yield is really gonna determine profitability. So these are decisions that we make. Because of the orientation of the crystal, it might have been the standard way would be cut down the C axis and having just that deeper blue color, but instead we're going to have a little bit, still blue, a little bit lighter blue color, but a larger stone. So at the end of the day, size is the name of the game, yield leads to profitability, and these are the decisions that we make. Now if you think about it, every single grain, every milligram of Paraiba dust has value. So now what we're looking at is a perfect little pear shape. Looks like a pear shape from here that we're going to yield with a super color and the most yield possible. We actually might still be around 10 points, maybe 15 points. If we're lucky, 20 points. Beautiful little pear shape. Every time he touches the stone to that lap wheel, that's dollars lost, that's yield down, that's cost. Every single time he touches that lap wheel. But this is the price that it takes. This is what these stones go through to turn into beautiful gems. They have to go through this process. So here is another situation that we contend with. So this is a stone that has a very clear fracture right down the middle.
This is the stone that if he touches the lap wheel with that stone, it's going to break in half. So inclusions are another thing that we really have to take into consideration when we are cutting stones. Here, very clearly, it's going to break into 2 stones. There you go. Look at that. He didn't even have to touch the lap wheel. It already turned into 2 stones. So this is something that immediately lessens the yield. This is another cost associated to this project. Stones that have inclusions where the crystal is not extremely well defined, well formed, you'll have these inclusions that will cause a lot of times the stone to break. And you see, before you'd even touch the lap wheel, it already broke into 2 stones. So now instead of having one large, let's say carat or carat and a half stone, probably a carat, maybe 80-point stone, we're gonna have 2 smaller, maybe 15 to 20-point stones. All of this translates into dollars lost and cost, additional cost. All decisions that get made as soon as we start putting stones to the lap wheel, but are things that we take into consideration before we even make the purchase. Now, when it's a lot of material, it's really hard to go through every single rough piece of stone. So a lot of times what we do is we'll take a sample, we'll try and understand from that sample what we can expect, and then we have to make a financial decision based on what we analyze from the rough sample. So we went through and we were kind of calculating yield, we were calculating more or less what we were gonna get from this process. But then you come down to things like crystal orientation, you come down to inclusions, what stones need to be heated and treated, what stones can stay natural, how many variations of color there are. All these things we take into consideration when we're considering a parcel of rough. And then once it touches the lap wheel, once it gets on the lap and we start cutting, is when you see the truth. You see the reality behind your purchase, behind your investment. Now, my uncle always says, when you buy the rough, you're extremely excited. It's a very exciting time buying the rough. Once you start cutting is when the depression hits, because you see all the loss, all of the pieces that start coming off of these stones as you're trying to create these tiny little formed gems. So it's a lot of loss. You see, look how beautiful that is. Oh my goodness. Beautiful little pear shape. So again, that's one of the pieces of that stone that broke. Rather than having one large stone, we have 2 smaller stones. Here's the second part of that stone that broke. It takes careful analysis. It takes a skilled individual to look and determine what the stone could turn into. Again, this one looks like it might have some inclusions on the inside of it as well. He's really got to determine what's the best shape to go for. This is a stone that potentially could be a nice little half-carat stone. Nice little half-carat Brazilian Paraiba Tourmaline. As you start putting it on the lap, you start seeing the reality of what the stone turns into. A lot of what we do is a bit of a guessing game. We have, in theory, we have an understanding of how much we're going to get from a production. Sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes you get more than what you expect. There's a big fracture in this stone here. He's probably going to break it in half now. Big fracture that makes a huge difference in the yield and what you're going to get. The more times it hits the lap wheel, the more chances there is for it to break. There we go, people. As it gets closer and closer to the inclusions on the inside of the stone, you start to hold your breath. You start to be unsure of what's going to come out, what's going to be the yield. So this is the second part of that larger stone, the one that just broke in his hands. The inclusions, again, play a huge part. When we're analyzing rough, we have to get an idea of what percentage of the rough has these problematic inclusions that will break on the lap. As we start cutting, the carat weight, what we actually yield, goes down and down and down. The yield goes from 30 to 20 to 10 even. And this is all stuff that makes a huge impact on what we can spend on these goods. Look at that, he's forming a beautiful little oval. What a process. Started with a little piece of rough, is now forming into a beautiful Brazilian little oval. Aesthetic little guy. You see this painstaking process. A lot of responsibilities on the hands of the former. Has to be very knowledgeable in the material to yield the most possible weight. So sometimes when stones aren't cut so perfectly, it's because of this process. You know, this is a very expensive process. Every time that stone hits the lap, that's money lost. That's stone gone. That's milligrams of carats that are disappearing. All of that translates into cost. Every single stone starts off as a piece of rough, starts off as a parcel. We have to determine if this is financially, if it makes sense, if it's a profitable investment, and then we start seeing the reality once stones start getting cut. Ain't that a pretty little thing? Wow, what a gem. Beautiful gem little oval. Incredible. This is another one that we're looking at here. This one has a fantastic color. This one is a little bit larger of a stone, but it does have some inclusion, so we need to be strategic in the way that we start, because the way that we start is going to determine what we get at the end. You've got an individual who is very, very well trained in analyzing the crystal to yield the best possible results. And the fact is, it's more weight is usually the direction that we want to go in with these smaller stones, only because if you were to cut everything aesthetically perfect, you would be yielding something like 10%, maybe less than that. And here he's going to decide, starts with the face first. So he puts the face of the stone on the crystal first, and then he starts forming. He wants a very clear face. He wants the most depth possible. You need depth in the stone for light return. You don't want anything very windowed. This is a great example of that. So he's starting to put some of the shape into the stone. He has the depth that he needs. He's putting the pavilion in place, rounding it out. He's probably going to go for an oval on this one. The whole idea is to utilize as much of the natural crystal as possible in the formation process to save as much weight as possible, because this rough is expensive. This is by far, kilo per kilo, the most expensive gem rough in Brazil today. All of this has to be taken into consideration when we're looking at a parcel. Most people see the finished product and don't realize how much was lost, how much investment made to bring that finished product and put it in a piece of jewelry. There he's making a beautiful little oval, spectacular little stone. Once the stones are formed, we go on to the process of determining if the stones need to be heated, if they need to be treated. If they make it through this first part here, this forming part, we have to determine, is it necessary to oil the stones? Is it necessary to heat the stones before we facet them? And once we facet them, they go through a rigorous process of faceting, a very aggressive, volatile process. The stones get heated on this lap wheel. This is actually yielding a really nice, maybe a half carat stone. Very nice half carat oval. I would deduce a half carat oval. Might be a little bit smaller, but a hell of a stone. It took about 5 minutes to form this stone. So imagine if there's 1,000 stones, it's 5,000, 4,000 minutes. I don't know what the math is on that, but it takes a long time.